There is a crime buried inside every war. Sometimes the crime is committed by the enemy. Sometimes it is committed by those who were supposed to be on your side. And sometimes, the most uncomfortable kind, the crime is committed by the very institution that was built to prevent it. This is a story about that second kind of crime, not the atrocities of the invader, which are well documented and undeniable, but the catastrophic failure of the machine that was supposed to stop him, a failure so enormous, so systematic, and so willfully obscured in the decades since, that it has been quietly rebranded as something else entirely. It has been called tragedy. It has been called inevitability. It has even been called heroism. It was none of those things. To understand what really happened in the summer of 1941, you have to go back much further. Not to the signing of any non-aggression pact, not to the intelligence reports that piled up on mahogany desks in Moscow, but to the very birth of the Red Army itself. Because the catastrophe of 1941 was not born on the 22nd of June. It was born in the chaos of a revolution, nurtured through a decade of dangerous mythology, and delivered fully formed into the hands of generals who had no idea what they were actually holding. The army that was never what it claimed to be. The Red Army entered the 1940s with a founding myth. It was the unconquerable vanguard of a new kind of people's war. Its origins, however, told a different story. It was built from the wreckage of the Russian Imperial Army, remade under Leon Trotsky in the fires of the Civil War, a conflict that bore almost no resemblance to the industrialized warfare of the 20th century. The Civil War was fought across vast, poorly mapped territories between irregular formations with improvised logistics and constantly shifting front lines. It rewarded boldness, momentum, and political zeal. It punished patience, fortification, and methodical defense. The Red Army absorbed every one of those lessons, and it never forgot them. And that, precisely, was the problem. Because what the Red Army was optimized for, fast-moving, aggressive, territory-devouring war, was not what a professional European army would bring to its doorstep. In 1920, when Soviet forces swept through Poland toward Warsaw in one of history's most audacious advances, they discovered, brutally, that revolutionary momentum was not a substitute for military science. The Polish army, organized, supplied, and fighting on home terrain, shattered the Soviet drive in what became known as the Battle of Warsaw, a defeat so embarrassing that Soviet military doctrine worked furiously for 2 decades to explain it away. They never truly reckoned with it, and that unresolved wound in the institutional memory of the Red Army would cost millions of lives. The doctrine that forbade thinking about defense. Here is something you will not find in most popular histories of the war. The Soviet Field Service Regulations of 1939, the official rulebook of the Red Army, the document that shaped how every general, every colonel, every military planner thought about warfare, contained a formal legislative prohibition on defensive thinking. Not a suggestion, not a preference, a prohibition. The doctrine was explicit. The Red Army existed to carry war onto the enemy's territory. It would strike first, strike hard, and destroy the adversary on his own soil. Victory would be achieved quickly, the suffering would be minimal, and Soviet blood would not stain Soviet ground. There was even a song, a perfectly cheerful, genuinely popular song called "If There Is War Tomorrow," that encapsulated the entire philosophy in 3 minutes. If there is war tomorrow, the chorus promised, if the enemy attacks, the unified Soviet people will rise for their homeland. And then the key line, the line that was not metaphor or propaganda, but literal military doctrine. We will beat the enemy on his own territory with little blood. This was not a slogan. This was the operational plan. Read that again slowly. An entire army of millions of men, an entire officer class trained over 20 years, an entire planning apparatus staffed by some of the sharpest military minds in the Soviet system, all of them legally, doctrinally, institutionally prohibited from seriously planning for what would happen if the enemy struck first. The false god of Khalkhin Gol. By 1939, the Red Army had an opportunity to test its doctrine against a real professional adversary. In Mongolia, along the Khalkhin Gol River, Soviet forces under the command of Georgy Zhukov confronted the Japanese Sixth Army. The result was a Soviet victory, a genuine, impressive, tactically sophisticated victory that ended in the near destruction of the Japanese force. Zhukov became a hero. The battle became a legend, and the wrong lessons were tattooed onto the brain of the Soviet military establishment. What the generals saw at Khalkhin Gol was confirmation of everything they already believed. Soviet tanks had dominated. Soviet coordination had been superior. Soviet will had prevailed. What they did not see, or chose not to see, was that Zhukov had assembled a uniquely concentrated, hand-picked force. He had enjoyed massive material superiority in the specific location of the battle. He had fought against a Japanese army that was itself operating at the end of a very long logistical chain, in terrain it barely understood, against a commander who had prepared the battlefield for months. Khalkhin Gol was not a template. It was a controlled experiment, but the Red Army treated it as a universal proof. Finland. The ice-cold reality check. Then came Finland. The Winter War of 1939 to 1940 should have destroyed every comfortable illusion the Red Army had about itself. The numbers alone should have made the outcome preordained. The Soviet Union against a nation of roughly 3.5 million people, with a fraction of the industrial capacity, a fraction of the manpower, and a fraction of the military hardware. Instead, the Red Army stumbled, bled, and was nearly stopped cold, literally, by a Finnish defensive system that no one in Moscow bothered to take seriously. The Mannerheim Line, a series of concrete bunkers and interlocking defensive positions, held for months against attackers who outnumbered and outgunned the defenders by ratios that should have made resistance mathematically impossible. The Red Army won eventually, but it won the way a large animal drowns a smaller one, through exhaustion, through numbers, through the pure weight of bodies committed to the effort. The tactical performance was, by any honest military assessment, catastrophic. Units lost communication with each other. Tanks advanced without infantry support and were destroyed. Officers who questioned orders were shot. Officers who gave good orders were sometimes shot anyway, by men above them who feared the questions their success might raise. Joseph Stalin sat through the after-action reports, and according to the minutes of the closed plenary session of the Central Committee in April of 1940, he said something that his generals did not want to hear. The cult of the traditions of the Civil War is holding us back. He was right. He saw it clearly. And then he did something remarkable. He acted on it. The numbers that should have made victory inevitable. Between April of 1940 and June of 1941, the Soviet defense establishment received more resources, more funding, and more urgent attention than at any prior point in its existence. The production lines for new tank designs, the T-34 and the KV-1, were accelerated. By the morning of the 22nd of June, 1941, the Red Army had in its arsenals 1,225 T-34 tanks. It had 636 KV tanks. Both of these machines were, by the technical standards of the day, superior to anything in the German inventory. The KV-1's armor was so thick that standard German anti-tank guns could not penetrate it at combat ranges. The total Soviet tank force numbered roughly 25,000 vehicles. The Wehrmacht brought fewer than 4,000 tanks to the invasion, 6-1. The Soviets had a 6-1 numerical advantage in the weapon class that defined modern warfare. How does an army with 6 times the tanks of its enemy collapse in weeks? The answer is not in the numbers. The answer is in the minds of the men who commanded those tanks. Men who looked at the number 25,000 and saw not a defensive wall, not a strategic reserve, not a set of tactical options, but a single overwhelming fist with which to strike. Men who had spent 20 years being told that the only correct form of military thinking was the attack. Men who read the Field Service Regulations of 1939 and believed every word. The Wehrmacht's generals, meanwhile, looked at the Soviet deployment maps and did not quite believe what they were seeing. They had expected to find an army preparing to receive a blow. Instead, they found an army leaning forward, positioned not for the war that was about to happen, but for a war it intended to start itself. They readjusted their plans accordingly. And then they struck. The catastrophe of 1941 was not born on the day of the invasion. It was already fully formed, waiting, written into doctrine, embedded in deployment, baked into the institutional culture of an army that had trained itself meticulously and at enormous cost to fight exactly the wrong war. There is a particular kind of disaster that does not arrive like a storm, sudden, unforeseeable, indiscriminate. There is another kind that arrives like a train, on schedule, on track, following a route that was laid down by human hands, in human time, with human decisions that could have been made differently at a dozen different points along the way. The summer of 1941 was the second kind. By the time the first German artillery shells crossed the border in the pre-dawn darkness of June 22nd, the catastrophe had already been engineered, not by the enemy, by the Soviet General Staff itself. The blueprint existed in ink, on paper, stamped with official seals and signed by men whose names would later be scrubbed from the historical record with the same thoroughness with which those men had scrubbed common sense from Soviet military planning. To understand what happened, you need to look at a map. And once you look at it properly, once you see what the Red Army's own commanders had arranged, you will understand why the German generals, when they studied their reconnaissance photographs and intelligence reports in the spring of 1941, reportedly struggled to believe what they were seeing. It looked like a gift. The salients, geography, turned into a death trap. The western border of the Soviet Union in 1941 was not a straight line. Two enormous bulges of Soviet-controlled territory protruded westward into what had been, until recently, Polish and Romanian land. The first was the Bialystok salient, a massive westward projection centered on the city of Bialystok, pushing deep into what would soon become the German axis of advance. The second was the Lvov salient in the south, a similar protrusion pointing like a finger toward the German and Romanian forces massing to the west. A salient, any military student learns this in the first weeks of serious study, is a liability. It is land that sticks out into enemy territory, which means it has a longer perimeter to defend, which means it is exposed on three sides rather than one. The standard military wisdom about salients is blunt. If you cannot attack from them, get out of them, because the enemy will pinch them off at the base and turn the troops inside into a pocket. The Soviet General Staff, Semyon Timoshenko as People's Commissar of Defense, Georgy Zhukov as Chief of the General Staff, did not get out of the salients. They filled them. They packed the two most exposed geographic positions on the entire western border with the cream of the Red Army. The best-equipped armies, the most modern tank formations, the largest concentrations of aviation assets. They did this because the salients looked, through the lens of offensive doctrine, like springboards. They were perfect for launching the preemptive strike that every plan assumed would come. You could thrust westward from Bialystok. You could thrust westward from Lvov. You could threaten to encircle anything between them. What you could not do, what nobody in the planning apparatus appeared to have seriously modeled, was survive when the enemy did the same thing to you first. the document that proves it was intentional. On the 15th of May, 1941, Georgy Zhukov, the man who would later spend decades positioning himself as the genius who saved the Soviet Union, sat down and wrote a memorandum to Joseph Stalin. The document, which survived the war in Soviet archives and was declassified decades later, is one of the most extraordinary pieces of paper in the history of the conflict. In it, Zhukov explicitly proposed that the Soviet Union launch a preemptive strike against Germany before Germany could strike first. He argued, in precise military language, that the Wehrmacht was in the process of deploying along the Soviet border and that the moment to act was now, before the deployment was complete. He asked Stalin for authorization to attack. Stalin did not authorize the attack. But the fact that Zhukov wrote the memorandum tells you everything you need to know about how the General Staff was thinking. They were not thinking about what to do if Germany attacked. They were thinking about how to attack Germany first. The entire deployment, the salients, the forward positioning of tank formations, the concentration of fuel and ammunition dumps within artillery range of the border, was built around that offensive assumption. When Germany struck first, that deployment became a catastrophe map. The fuel dumps were overrun on the first day. The ammunition stores were captured before the units they were meant to supply could reach them. The forward tank formations, positioned to thrust westward, suddenly found themselves trying to fight eastward, away from their logistics, into an enemy that was already behind them. 11 hours on the Northwestern Front. The Northwestern Front, covering the Baltic states and the approaches to Leningrad, provides perhaps the purest illustration of what happens when an army has been positioned for the wrong war. The 11th Army held the sector directly in the path of the German Army Group North's advance. Its units were deployed forward, close to the border, in positions that made tactical sense for an attacking force and almost none for a defending one. When the German assault began before dawn on June 22nd, the 11th Army did not have hours to respond. It did not have time to fall back to prepared positions, because prepared defensive positions had not been built. They had not been built because the doctrine said they would not be needed. Within approximately 5 hours of the opening barrage, the 11th Army had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Not because its soldiers were cowards, not because its equipment was inferior, but because the units were in the wrong place, oriented in the wrong direction, with command structures that had been severed by the first German strikes on communications infrastructure, strikes that the Germans had planned for and the Soviets had not planned against. 5 hours, one of the largest armies on the northwestern axis of the entire front, gone in roughly the time it takes to drive from one city to another. The 8th Corps and its murderous march. The story of the 8th Mechanized Corps, commanded by General Dmitry Ryabyshev, deserves its own monument, not to heroism, but to the particular agony of military competence destroyed by military stupidity from above. The 8th Corps was on paper one of the most powerful armored formations in the world. It possessed hundreds of modern tanks, T-34s and KVs among them, with crews that had trained extensively and officers who understood their machines. In the opening days of the war, as the Southwestern Front buckled under the German pressure, Ryabyshev received orders to counterattack. Then he received different orders. Then he received orders to move in a different direction entirely. Then he was ordered back. Then forward again. Over the course of several days, the 8th Corps marched and countermarched across hundreds of kilometers of Ukrainian roads in midsummer heat. The tanks, even the best tanks, are not designed for road marches of that duration without maintenance stops. Engines overheated and seized. Tracks through their pins and left machines sitting in ditches. Fuel consumption outran the supply chain. By the time Ryabyshev's corps finally made contact with the enemy in any organized fashion, it had lost a catastrophic percentage of its vehicles not to German fire, but to the roads, the heat, and the chaos of contradictory orders issued by commanders who had no coherent picture of the battle they were trying to fight. The battle that should have changed everything between June 23rd and 30 in the area around Dubno and Brody in what is now western Ukraine, the largest tank battle in history to that point, was fought. The numbers involved were staggering. On the Soviet side, approximately 3,000 armored vehicles were committed across multiple mechanized corps. Against them, the German 1st Panzer Group under Ewald von Kleist could field fewer than 900 tanks. 3,000 against fewer than 900. A ratio of more than 3-to-1 in favor of the Soviets, in the weapon type that should have been decisive. The Soviets lost. Not narrowly, not after a valiant struggle that came close to turning the tide. They lost comprehensively, and the reason can be stated simply. 3,000 tanks committed in uncoordinated piecemeal attacks by corps that could not communicate with each other and had not been given a unified operational plan are not equivalent to 3,000 tanks fighting as a concentrated directed force. They are equivalent in practical military terms to perhaps a third of that number, or less. The German panzer commanders, men who had fought in Poland, who had sliced through France in 40 days, who had spent years developing the doctrine of concentrated armored assault, watched the Soviet attacks arrive in sequence rather than simultaneously, exploited the gaps between them, and destroyed each formation in detail before the next one arrived. The order that finished the Western Front. At 7:15 in the morning of June 22nd, with German forces already dozens of kilometers inside Soviet territory on multiple acts, with the forward armies in various stages of disintegration, with German aircraft destroying Soviet planes on airfields that had not been dispersed despite weeks of warning, the following directive arrived from Moscow to the front commanders. Directive number 2. It ordered Soviet forces to attack, not to stabilize, not to establish defensive lines, not to assess the situation and report back, to attack, to cross the border, to strike German territory, to destroy the enemy on his own soil with little blood, exactly as the song had promised. By 7:15 on the morning of June 22nd, the war that Directive Number 2 described, the war in which Soviet armies would counterattack from their prepared forward positions, had already ceased to be possible. The forward positions were gone. The armies that were supposed to hold them were in pieces. The command structures that would have coordinated the attack had been severed in the opening hours. Directive Number 2 did not redirect surviving Soviet forces toward a viable alternative. It ensured that whatever cohesion remained in the Western Front would be expended in pointless forward movement, away from any defensible terrain, into the teeth of an enemy that was already operating in their rear. It was the finishing blow, delivered not by Germany, but by Moscow. The exception that proves the rule. There was one commander who understood what was happening. General Mikhail Potapov, commanding the Fifth Army on the Southwestern Front, did something radical. He ignored the spirit of his orders. Instead of committing his forces to the kind of disjointed counterattacks that were consuming every other armored formation, he used them to fight a flexible, terrain-conscious defensive action. He gave ground when ground needed to be given. He preserved his command structure. He kept his units in communication. The Fifth Army held. For 2 months, while armies to its north and south collapsed in days, Potapov's force remained a coherent fighting entity. It tied down 21 German divisions. 21. Divisions that could not be sent elsewhere, that could not reinforce the drives toward Moscow or Leningrad, that sat in front of the Fifth Army absorbing casualties and burning fuel they could not replace. Potapov did not follow the plan. He followed the terrain, the mathematics, and his own military judgment, and he achieved, almost alone, what the entire general staff had failed to achieve with its thousands of tanks and millions of men. He showed that it was possible, that the army could fight, that the disaster was not inevitable, which means someone chose it. Before we go any further, let us establish something that will feel, to many readers, deeply uncomfortable. Joseph Stalin, the name that has functioned for 80 years as the single-word answer to every question about Soviet failure in 1941, was not the commander of the Red Army on the morning of June 22nd. He was not the architect of the deployment. He was not the man who signed the orders that sent Soviet tank formations marching in circles across Ukrainian roads until their engines died. He was not the author of Directive Number 2. This is not a rehabilitation. It is not an attempt to rescue a historical reputation that deserves no rescue. Stalin was a tyrant. The record of his crimes against his own people is vast and documented and undeniable. But the question we are asking here is specific. Who bears military responsibility for the catastrophe of 1941? And the answer to that specific question has been deliberately, systematically, institutionally falsified for the better part of a century. The falsification serves people who are still, in various forms, with us today. Let us look at what actually happened. The position that did not exist. On the morning of June 22, 1941, the post of Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces of the Soviet Union did not exist. It was not a position anyone held. The legal and institutional structure of Soviet military command was as follows. The People's Commissar of Defense, the equivalent of a Minister of War, was Semyon Timoshenko. The Chief of the General Staff, responsible for operational planning and the direction of military operations, was Georgy Zhukov. Stalin held no military command position whatsoever on that morning. His role in the Soviet government was political. General Secretary of the Communist Party, Chairman of the Council of People's Commissars. These were positions of enormous political power. They were not military command posts. Timoshenko commanded the armed forces. Zhukov directed the general staff. The front commanders reported to Zhukov. Zhukov reported to Timoshenko. Timoshenko reported to the political leadership. Stalin did not acquire the title of People's Commissar of Defense until the 19th of July, 27 days after the invasion began. He did not become Supreme Commander until the 8th of August. By that point, the entire first strategic echelon of the Red Army, the professional, trained, equipped force that had been positioned along the western border, had been effectively destroyed. The great encirclements at Bialystok, at Minsk, at Uman, all of them occurred before Stalin held any formal military command. Every tank lost in the killing fields of Ukraine in late June. Every army that ceased to exist in the first week. Every front that collapsed before a coherent defensive line could be established. All of it happened while Timoshenko and Zhukov were in command. What Stalin was actually doing. The journal of visitors to Stalin's Kremlin office, a document maintained with bureaucratic precision and cross-referenced with other records, shows us, hour by hour, what the Soviet leader was doing in the days after the invasion. He was working 18 to 20 hours a day, by the evidence of the visitor logs. The meetings were continuous, with industrial commissars, with railway officials, with economists, with members of the State Defense Committee that was hastily assembled in the first days of the war. The subjects of those meetings, drawn from records and memoirs of participants, were the things that Stalin understood and that fell within his actual authority. The mobilization of the civilian economy for war production, the organization of the evacuation of industrial facilities from the western regions that were already falling to the Germans, the political management of a country that was absorbing a shock of almost incomprehensible magnitude, the relocation of Soviet industry eastward, the movement of over 1,500 major industrial enterprises from the Western Soviet Union to the Urals and Siberia in the months following the invasion, is one of the most extraordinary logistical achievements in the history of warfare. It was coordinated from Moscow. It saved the war. And it happened because someone was managing it while the generals were managing the front. Meanwhile, the Stavka, the military high command established in the first days of the war, was nominally chaired by Timoshenko, with Zhukov as its chief operational mind. The front commanders received their orders from the Stavka. The catastrophic directives of the first week, including Directive Number 2, came from the Stavka. The lie told to a leader's face. On the 29th of June, 1941, 1 week after the invasion, Joseph Stalin learned that the city of Minsk had fallen. He did not learn this from Georgy Zhukov. He did not learn it from Semyon Timoshenko. He did not learn it from any official military channel. He learned it from a foreign radio broadcast. Minsk, the capital of Belarusia, a major city, a critical transport hub, the anchor of the entire Central Front, had been captured by German forces, and the chief of the General Staff of the Soviet Armed Forces had not informed the political leadership. The armies of the Western Front had been encircled. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were already in German captivity, and Zhukov, by the evidence of multiple accounts from participants, had been providing Moscow with reports that did not reflect this reality. The accounts of what happened when Stalin arrived at the People's Commissariat of Defense that evening, unannounced, with several members of the Politburo, describe scenes of institutional chaos. The command picture that Zhukov and Timoshenko had been presenting to Moscow bore little relationship to what had actually occurred on the ground. The Western Front had not been conducting a fighting withdrawal. It had, in significant portions, simply ceased to exist. This is the moment, not the morning of June 22nd, not the signing of the Non-Aggression Pact, not the repression of the Officer Corps in 1937, that deserves to be understood as the hinge of the entire catastrophe. The commander of the General Staff had looked his political superior in the face for 7 days and told him a story that was not true. And during those 7 days, because the true picture was concealed, no intervention was possible. No reserves could be intelligently directed. No alternative strategy could be formulated. The machine had to collapse further before anyone with the authority to redirect it was allowed to see what was actually happening. The alternative that was always possible. Here is the question that changes everything. Could it have been different? The standard answer, the answer that has been embedded in Soviet and post-Soviet historiography, in memoirs and documentaries and school curricula for generations, is no. The Wehrmacht was too strong. The surprise was too complete. The forces were too unevenly matched. Any army would have broken. This answer is false, and it is demonstrably false, because we have multiple examples from the same conflict of what happens when a properly organized defensive strategy is applied against the same enemy. Consider the Finnish example first. In the Winter War, a nation with a population of roughly 3.5 million people, equipped with weapons that were outdated by comparison, to either major combatant in the larger conflict, held the Red Army, an army with overwhelming numerical superiority in every category, for more than 3 months. The instrument of that defense was the Mannerheim Line, a system of fortifications, carefully sighted obstacles, and coordinated defensive depth that forced the attacker to pay an enormous price for every kilometer of advance. The Soviet Union had the western rivers, the Niemen, the Styr, the Dniester, and the terrain between them. It had time, before the invasion, to prepare defensive positions along those lines. It had the engineering capacity, the manpower, and the material resources to create something comparable to what Finland had built on a fraction of its budget. It chose not to, because the doctrine said that defense was capitulation. Consider the later Soviet examples. At Kursk in the summer of 1943, against the same Wehrmacht, with the same generals, fighting with the same fundamental tactical doctrine, the Red Army absorbed the largest German armored offensive of the war from prepared defensive positions and broke it completely. The defensive works at Kursk extended to a depth of approximately 300 kilometers. They were layered, mined, covered by anti-tank artillery, and supported by armored reserves positioned to counterattack from strength rather than desperation. The Germans ran out of momentum, then tanks, then options. The battle lasted roughly 7 weeks. The German offensive capability on the Eastern Front never fully recovered. The same method applied earlier against a Wehrmacht that in the summer of 1941 was operating at the extreme end of its logistical reach, fighting on a front wider than any army in history had attempted to cover, would have produced a fundamentally different war. The mathematics are not complicated. A German army advancing against prepared Soviet defenses at an exchange ratio of 3 or 4 Soviet casualties for every German casualty, which is approximately what organized Soviet defensive fighting achieved when it occurred, would have found itself in an unsustainable position well before it reached Moscow. The German tank force of fewer than 4,000 vehicles, sustaining the losses that determined resistance inflicted when it occurred, would have been effectively expended somewhere between the border and Minsk. The Blitzkrieg required momentum. Momentum requires continuous advance. Continuous advance against organized resistance over the distances involved in the Soviet Union was a mathematical impossibility. The only reason it succeeded, the only reason, is that the resistance it encountered in the critical opening weeks was not organized. Who made it disorganized? The disorganization was not an accident of war. It was a product of planning. The planning was done by Timoshenko and Zhukov. The deployment, forward into the salients positioned for attack, was their deployment. The doctrine, offensive at all costs, no serious preparation for defense, was their doctrine. The directives, including Directive Number 2, issued when the situation it described no longer existed, were their directives. The lies told to Moscow in the first week, the concealment of the true scale of the disaster, while any intervention was still possible, were their lies. None of this is speculation. The documents exist. The deployment maps survive. The timeline of the directives is a matter of public record. The visitor logs of Stalin's office establish, with the precision of a court document, who held what authority and when. The memoirs of participants, including Zhukov's own memoirs, read carefully against the documentary record rather than accepted at face value, contain the contradictions and evasions of men who knew where the bodies were buried because they had buried them. The shape of what was lost. On the morning of June 22nd, the Red Army possessed 1,225 T-34 tanks, whose armor the standard German anti-tank gun could not penetrate. It possessed 636 KV-1 tanks so heavily armored that individual vehicles halted German advances for hours, while the enemy searched desperately for weapons that could stop them. It possessed an air force of thousands of aircraft. It possessed millions of trained soldiers. By the end of August, before Stalin had held formal military command for even a month, the greater portion of that force was gone. Not defeated in fair battle against a superior enemy. Encircled, captured, and destroyed by a smaller force that had the advantage of attacking an army that had been arranged, by its own commanders, into the perfect geometry for annihilation. The men in those encirclements were not statistics. They were human beings who had done what soldiers do. They had trusted the institution that equipped them and trained them and positioned them to know what it was doing. That trust was not repaid. 80 years later, the men who failed those soldiers are still protected. The institutions that protect them are still functioning. The myth that covers their responsibility is still being actively maintained. Every great crime needs a cover story. The more powerful the crime, the more elaborate the cover story must be. And if the crime is large enough, if it involves the deaths of millions of people, the destruction of an entire army, the deliberate falsification of a nation's foundational trauma, then the cover story cannot be maintained by one person, or one institution, or one generation. It requires a system, a self-perpetuating mechanism that recruits new defenders as old ones die, that adapts its language to new political environments while preserving its essential function, that punishes those who ask the wrong questions with the tools available in each successive era. The Soviet Union had the Gulag for that purpose. What came after has something arguably more durable: reputation, access, and the quiet, devastating power of institutional gatekeeping. This is the story of how the lie about 1941 was constructed, who built it, who maintains it today, and what it costs every time another generation accepts it without examination. The deal. Nikita Khrushchev came to power after Stalin's death in 1953 in a position of genuine political vulnerability. The Soviet system was a structure built on the personal authority of a single figure, and that figure was gone. The men who surrounded the vacancy, Beria, Malenkov, Molotov, and others, were each capable, each dangerous, and each possessed of their own claims to succession. Khrushchev needed allies, and the most valuable ally available in terms of institutional prestige and public legitimacy was the man the Soviet press had spent a decade celebrating as the greatest military genius of the war, Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov, in 1953, had his own problem. He had spent the final years of Stalin's life in a kind of enforced semi-obscurity, removed from positions of real authority after the war by a leader who had reason to be suspicious of generals with independent reputations and popular followings. With Stalin dead, Zhukov's path back to power and prominence ran directly through whoever consolidated control of the Soviet state. The transaction between Khrushchev and Zhukov was never written down in any document that has been found. It did not need to be. Both men were sophisticated enough to understand what was being exchanged without articulating it explicitly. Khrushchev would use Zhukov's military prestige to legitimize his own authority, including critically in the arrest of Beria and the subsequent consolidation of the party leadership. Zhukov would use Khrushchev's political protection to return to the center of Soviet public life and, more importantly, to shape how the war he had helped to lose was remembered. The result of that transaction was the legend of 1941 as it has been told in the decades since. The legend and its architecture. The legend has 3 load-bearing pillars. Remove any one of them and the structure collapses. All 3 are false. The first pillar. Stalin trusted Hitler and refused to allow the military to prepare for the attack. In this version of events, Soviet forces were caught unprepared because the paranoid dictator, in thrall to the Non-Aggression Pact, forbade any defensive action that might provoke the Germans. Generals who wanted to act were paralyzed by fear of Stalin's reaction. The disaster was the product of one man's delusion. The documents do not support this. The intelligence reporting to Stalin in the spring of 1941 was extensive, consistent, and alarming. Multiple sources, including the Soviet spy network in Germany and occupied Europe, diplomatic reporting from Soviet missions abroad, and military intelligence assessments, identified the German buildup with increasing precision as the months passed. Stalin's response to this intelligence was not to ignore it, but to engage in a calculated attempt to delay confrontation, while the Soviet military completed its reorganization and re-equipment. He was buying time, not denying reality. The question of whether he bought enough time and whether he was right to think more time could be bought is legitimate. The claim that he believed no attack was coming, that he was deceived by Hitler, is not supported by the available evidence. His actions in the final months before the invasion are the actions of a man who knew confrontation was inevitable and was trying to control its timing. The generals who later claimed paralysis by Stalin's fear of provocation never explained why. If they believed immediate action was essential, none of them formally submitted their objections through official channels and requested to be relieved of command if those objections were overruled. That is what a military officer does when ordered to do something he believes will result in catastrophe. None of them did it, because the plan, their plan, was the one they believed in. The second pillar, the political repression of 1937 and 38, destroyed the competent officer corps and left the Army in the hands of inexperienced men who could not manage a modern military operation. This argument is more sophisticated, which is why it has been more durably persuasive. It is also, on examination, deeply misleading. The repression of the late 1930s did strike the Soviet officer corps. Senior figures were removed, imprisoned, and in some cases executed. This was a genuine catastrophe in human terms and a genuine disruption in institutional terms. No honest account of the period can minimize it. But the commanders who led the Red Army into the disasters of 1941 were not inexperienced replacements elevated beyond their competence. Georgy Zhukov had been a senior military figure throughout the period of repression and rose through it. Ivan Konev had extensive experience. Konstantin Rokossovsky, who would later become one of the most capable operational commanders the war produced, had spent time in prison during the repression and was released in time to command at a high level in the opening phase of the war. The repression in practice struck hardest at the most politically active senior officers, men whose prominence made them visible targets in the political struggles of the period. It did not systematically eliminate technical competence from the officer corps. The men who commanded in June of 1941 had, in most cases, spent their careers preparing for exactly this moment. They failed not because they were inexperienced, but because they were wrong, doctrinally, operationally, and in their fundamental conception of the war they were about to fight. The third pillar, organized defense, was impossible given the circumstances. The forces were too dispersed, the territory too vast, the enemy too powerful for any defensive strategy to have succeeded. General Potapov's Fifth Army answered this argument in real time, in real conditions, against the real Wehrmacht, and the answer it gave was false. The Mannerheim Line answered it. Kursk answered it. Every instance in which Soviet forces fought from prepared positions answered it. Defense was not only possible, it was, by the mathematical evidence of actual combat results, dramatically more efficient than the attacks the General Staff ordered. The machinery of suppression. After Khrushchev and Zhukov established the narrative, the Soviet historical establishment, the institutes, the journals, the approved memoir series, the military academies, built the architecture that would maintain it. Access to archives was controlled. Researchers who produced inconvenient conclusions found their work unpublished, their careers redirected. The veterans who survived were encouraged to tell the stories that fit the framework and discouraged, with varying degrees of pressure, from telling the ones that did not. Zhukov's own memoirs, published in 1969 and revised in subsequent editions, are a masterwork of selective memory. The passages dealing with the opening days of the war are notable for what is absent rather than what is present. The memorandum of May 15th proposing a preemptive strike is not mentioned. The content of the directives issued in the first hours is softened. The role of front commanders in the disasters that followed is attributed to the chaos of the situation, rather than the failures of planning. What is present in extraordinary detail is every subsequent success, every correct decision, every moment in which Zhukov's judgment was vindicated. The memoirs of a man who helped design a catastrophe read, in their final form, as the autobiography of a visionary who was tragically constrained by others from preventing it. The modern gatekeepers. Here is where the history becomes current affairs. The institutional apparatus that Khrushchev and Zhukov built did not dissolve with the Soviet Union. It transformed. The archives opened, partially, selectively, with significant portions remaining classified or difficult to access. A new generation of military historians emerged, some genuinely attempting to work with the documentary record, others operating with agendas that would have been familiar to their Soviet predecessors. The online space that emerged in the Russian-speaking world in the 2000s and 2010s created, for the first time, a genuine public forum for historical debate. Independent researchers, some trained historians, some amateurs with access to digitized archives and the analytical skills to use them, began publishing work that engaged seriously with the documents. The questions they raised were the questions this investigation has been following. Who commanded, who planned, who lied, and who built the narrative that replaced the truth? The response from the established historical community was not engagement with the documents. It was the deployment of labels. The word revisionist, which in honest historical usage simply means a researcher who revises established interpretations on the basis of new evidence, which is what historians are supposed to do, was weaponized into an accusation. Researchers who cited documents inconvenient to the Zhukov legend were associated, through insinuation rather than argument, with discredited theories or with political positions their work did not actually support. The discussion was not one on evidence. It was managed through the control of reputational access. Certain prominent figures in the contemporary Russian historical media landscape, commentators, documentary presenters, authors with large public followings, have built significant audiences on content that engages with military history in ways that consistently, reliably, and one suspects not accidentally, avoid the specific questions this investigation has been asking. The questions about command responsibility, the questions about the deployment, the questions about who signed which directive and when and what they knew. These figures are not stupid. They are not ignorant of the documents. They have made choices about which questions to ask and which to leave unasked. Those choices have consequences. The cost of the myth. The maintenance of a false historical narrative is never free. It always costs something. The question is who pays. In this case, the payment has been made in several currencies simultaneously. The first is the most obvious. The soldiers who died in the killing fields of 1941 deserved an honest accounting of why they were placed in those fields, in those positions, with those orders. They have not received one. Their deaths have been folded into a narrative of inevitable tragedy and national heroism that, while not entirely false in its celebration of individual courage, is comprehensively false in its account of institutional responsibility. They deserved better. Their descendants deserve better. The second cost is analytical. A society that cannot honestly examine why its military failed catastrophically in a specific historical instance cannot extract the lessons that failure contains. The lesson of 1941, that doctrine divorced from reality, that planning optimized for the war you want to fight rather than the war you will face, that command cultures that punish honest reporting and reward optimistic falsification, is a lesson of permanent relevance. It did not expire with the Soviet Union. Armies, institutions, and planning bureaucracies face versions of this failure in every generation. Covering the failure protects the reputations of the dead. It also ensures that the living will not learn from them. The third cost is the most insidious: the normalization of institutional lying as a response to institutional failure. When a society learns that the correct response to catastrophic failure is not accountability and analysis, but narrative management and the discrediting of those who ask questions, it learns something deeply destructive about how power operates. It learns that failure at the top is always someone else's fault, that the documents can always be reinterpreted, and that reputation is a weapon to be deployed against evidence. The distinction that must be made. There is a distinction at the heart of this entire investigation, and it must be stated as clearly as language allows. The soldiers of the Soviet Union who fought in the summer of 1941 performed acts of extraordinary courage under conditions of almost incomprehensible difficulty. Men who had been encircled, cut off, deprived of supply and communication and command, continued fighting. Men who had been given orders that made no tactical sense carried them out anyway, because they believed in what they were defending. Men who had every rational reason to believe the situation was hopeless chose to make the enemy pay the highest possible price regardless. That courage is real. That sacrifice is real. That story belongs to the soldiers, and it is not diminished by a single word of this investigation. What belongs to the generals, to Timoshenko, to Zhukov, to the planning apparatus that built the deployment and wrote the doctrine and issued the directives, is something different. It is the responsibility for placing those courageous men in positions designed by their own incompetence and their own institutional blindness to produce maximum casualties with minimum military effect. It is the responsibility for concealing the scale of the disaster from the political leadership during the critical first week. It is the responsibility for the cover story that followed. The people's courage was genuine. The staff's failure was catastrophic. These two facts do not contradict each other. They must be held simultaneously, because only when they are both acknowledged can either one be properly understood. The names that must be said. History does not have a self-correcting mechanism. It does not automatically arrive at truth given sufficient time. Truth in history arrives when enough people decide that the cost of the lie has become greater than the discomfort of the accounting. We are past that point. The names are known. The documents are available. The timeline is reconstructible from public sources. The deployment maps survive. The directives survive. The visitor logs survive. The gap between the situation as it was and the situation as it was reported to Moscow survives in the contradiction between what Zhukov wrote in his reports and what German forces were actually doing at the time those reports were written. What does not survive is the excuse that we did not know. That excuse was barely credible in 1960. It is not credible at all today. The soldiers of 1941 marched into killing fields that their own commanders designed. They deserve, at minimum, the acknowledgement of that fact. They deserve the honest answer to the question this investigation began with. Who really almost lost the war in 1941? Not Stalin, not the soldiers, not the Soviet people, who endured and produced and sacrificed on a scale that beggars description. The men who built an army of illusions, the men who drew the geometry of death onto deployment maps and called it strategy. The men who concealed the catastrophe while it was still unfolding and constructed, in the decades that followed, a legend to replace the record. They had names. The names are in the documents. It is time to read them.